Developing story in Hong Kong, where a deadline has been set and the clock is ticking. The next 12 hours are critical to Hong Kong's future. The threat from the city's leader to protesters is clear. Get out of the streets by Monday morning, or all necessary actions will be taken to restore social order. In the last few hours, we've learned that some protesters have pulled back from a sit-in outside the offices of Hong Kong's leader. The handshake deal between a pro-democracy protester and a police officer appeared to stem the threat of immediate confrontation. But thousands remain in the streets, protesting the Chinese government's decision to vet candidates for an upcoming election. The country's attempt to tighten control of Hong Kong's political process is viewed as a broken promise, a promise made in 1997 to allow Hong Kong to elect its own leader in 2017.
This is not a color revolution. This is only a movement of Hong Kong people to strive for democracy, to get back the rights, the political rights that should be enjoyed by Hong Kong people.
The protest's first week was mostly peaceful, a snapshot of successful civil disobedience. Images of umbrellas and singing prevailed. The protesters, who were mostly students and young professionals, were observed as polite as they picked up trash and sorted for recycling. But in the last few days, pro-Beijing demonstrators have tried to forcibly shut down the rallies. The counter-demonstrators provoked bloody scuffles, and women have reported being sexually assaulted and harassed. The director of Amnesty International Hong Kong says the city's police force is present, but failing to protect peaceful protesters. When Hong Kong, the former British colony, was returned to China, it created a unique arrangement, commonly referred to as one country, two systems. That structure encouraged the free flow of Western capital to continue, and much to Hong Kong and China's economic benefit. At the time of the handover, Hong Kong made up 16% of China's GDP, but now it's a meager 3%. Many say that's part of the reason China has decided to flex its muscle. But it's not that simple. Hong Kong remains relevant as a critical and stable hub for international investment. Joining me now, Peter Goodman, editor-in-chief of the International Business Times, Jillian Melcher, a writer for National Review as a fellow for the Franklin Center and Independent Women's Forum, Christina Greer, assistant professor of political science at Fordham University, and Gordon Chang, columnist at Forbes.com and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
So, Gordon, tell us first, what should we make of these protests and what's going to happen?
I think on Monday morning we're going to know a lot more, because I don't think the protesters are going to leave the streets, which is really what CY Leung, the chief executive of Hong Kong, in other words, the new governor, is basically going to say, get out. Now, I think it's a hollow threat. We have seen them use force before. On Sunday, we saw the use of the triads on Friday. It didn't work. Matter of fact, it was counterproductive.
And can you tell us what the triads are?
The triads are basically gangsters or goons. And we have seen them very active in Hong Kong this year. There was a near-fatal beating of a journalist at the end of February, and we've seen other incidents that they've been involved in. And of course, we saw them on Friday as they attacked protesters in both two locations, coordinated, same time, same tactics. Really was directed by somebody, probably Beijing.
Peter, how is this different from the response to China in 1989, and we all have images of Tiananmen Square in our head?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, one of the dynamics that makes this very volatile is, as you alluded to in the opening segment, this goes back to '97 and the handover of Hong Kong, which was then a British colony, back to China, and the creation of this one country, two systems scenario. Well, there's part of this movement that says we just want that promise of what we got in '97. We want democracy here. We want to be able to directly elect our leadership. But there are a lot of young people who barely remember '97, let alone 1989, when Beijing opened fire on protesters in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, who are essentially saying, we don't want one country, two systems. We want our own country. We don't want China. We don't want to have to compete with an influx of mainland students for slots at university. We don't want the pollution that they have in China. We don't want the sense of dysfunction that pervades in a lot of major Chinese cities. And at the same time, for the leadership in Beijing and the proxy leadership in Hong Kong, it's a highly volatile situation because they're now dug in. They've essentially said, you got to get out. And for the party in Beijing, their legitimacy today rests on their ability to improve living standards across China and nationalism. And, let's not forget this flexing of muscles that you're talking about. It's not just Hong Kong. I mean, there's been a crackdown on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. There is some loosening we see in terms of relationships with Tibet. But the nationalism that we see playing out in terms of confrontation with Japan and the East China Sea, with many Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea, this is part of the leadership in Beijing essentially saying, we're done with worrying about public opinion. We're now a strong superpower, and we're going to do what we want to do. So you have students on the one hand, really dug in, saying we're not going to accept anything less than the chief executive leaving and direct suffrage, as promised in '97. And you have a leadership in Beijing saying, we're not playing around here. It's time to get on with business.
Christina, in terms of social movements and civil disobedience, and Peter just mentioned that Beijing is not as concerned about public opinion as maybe other leaders in democracies are. How do you think this protest might play itself out?
Well, we know that it's already affected global markets tremendously, right? Because a peaceful Hong Kong essentially makes global markets feel very safe. But when we see this unrest, right, because we know that many people can't necessarily rely on Chinese judicial systems, and there is a lack of trust when it comes to China in many ways. So we're looking at Hong Kong as stability, right? Not just because of the geographic locale. So when we think about social movements and how this could sort of catch fire in other issues that we're talking about, say Tibet, say different provinces across China, this is very concerning for, I think, the larger Chinese government to really think about young people as the future of making movements happen.
Jillian, in terms of, and Christina just mentioned this issue of stability in financial markets, is the world watching?
Yeah, I think the world's absolutely watching, and I think inside of China is watching too. So what Hong Kongers are basically saying is that they've had economic liberty. They're more economically free than the United States, but economic liberty isn't enough. You look at that model in mainland China, and it's resulted in rampant corruption and extreme materialism that plays out in horrible ways. They don't want that. They want some political check on it. So I think for China, this has become existential, because if Hong Kongers can push and get it, mainland China is going to want to get it too.
Everyone stay with me. We need to take a quick break. More on the unrest in Hong Kong and suspicion of government-sanctioned gang violence when we come back.